For years, the truth stayed hidden. The victims forgotten, the cases left cold, until science revealed what time could not. This is decades in the dark, where cold cases are brought back to light. The night Susan Powell disappeared, Utah was buried under fresh snow. December 6, 2009 had been an ordinary Sunday in the Powell home in West Valley City. Susan spent the evening with her two young sons, 4-year-old Charlie and 2-year-old Braden. Friends later said she seemed tired but normal. The quiet exhaustion of a young mother balancing work, family, and a marriage that had grown increasingly strained. By morning, she was gone. Her purse was still inside the house. Her phone was left behind. Her car sat in the driveway under a thin layer of new snow. Nothing inside the home appeared disturbed. But her husband had a story. Josh Powell told investigators that sometime after midnight, he decided to take his sons on a spontaneous camping trip. In the middle of winter, during a snowstorm. He said he loaded the boys into the family minivan and drove into the Utah desert. According to Josh, they arrived near a remote area west of the city sometime in the early morning hours. He claimed the boys slept in the vehicle while he wandered the desert alone. Then, as the sun rose, he simply drove back home. Investigators listened carefully. The story immediately raised questions. Camping in freezing temperatures with 2 small children, leaving in the middle of the night, driving hours into a desert wilderness. And yet, despite the strange explanation, there was one thing investigators could not ignore. The boys were alive. Susan Powell was missing. When police began looking more closely at the Powell's home, the case shifted from puzzling to deeply unsettling. Susan's friends came forward with troubling details about the marriage. She had confided that she was afraid of Josh. Their relationship had deteriorated into constant arguments about finances, control, and secrecy. Susan had even taken an unusual precaution. Weeks before she disappeared, she wrote a letter. "If I disappear," the letter read, "it may not be an accident." Those words would haunt investigators for years. As police continued digging into the couple's life, the timeline of the night Susan vanished became increasingly suspicious. Josh's phone had been turned off for hours during the alleged camping trip. There were no photographs from the outing, no clear evidence the children had even been awake. When detectives interviewed Charlie, the older boy, he made a simple statement that chilled investigators. He said his mother had been with them when they left, but she never came home. The investigation soon expanded beyond the house and beyond Josh. Detectives began learning more about Josh's family, particularly his father, Steve Powell, who lived in Washington State. Steve Powell had developed a disturbing obsession with Susan. Investigators later discovered that Steve had secretly recorded hundreds of hours of audio inside his own home. Much of it focused on Susan. Conversations, private moments, even personal reflections where he spoke about being romantically obsessed with his daughter-in-law. His writings revealed a fixation that investigators described as deeply disturbing. The Powell family dynamics were becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, forensic teams searched everywhere they could. The Powell's home was examined for trace evidence. Detectives searched the Utah desert areas where Josh claimed to have camped. Snow and weather conditions complicated the search, erasing potential tracks and physical evidence. Months passed, then years. Despite thousands of tips and extensive searches, Susan Powell was never found. The investigation slowly transformed from a missing person case into something else, a homicide investigation without a body. As suspicion around Josh intensified, his life began to unravel. In 2011, his father, Steve Powell, was arrested in Washington State on charges related to voyeurism and possession of illicit recordings. Police seized massive amounts of evidence from his home, including journals and audio recordings. The bizarre revelations surrounding the Powell family only deepened the mystery surrounding Susan's disappearance. By that time, authorities in Utah had publicly named Josh Powell a person of interest in Susan's disappearance, but they still lacked enough evidence to charge him. Then the tragedy escalated. In September 2011, nearly 2 years after Susan vanished, Josh Powell lost custody of his sons. A Washington court ruled that the boys would temporarily live with Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, while the investigation continued. For the Cox family, it was a small piece of hope. Charlie and Braden were safe, or at least they thought they were. On February 5, 2012, a social worker arrived at Josh Powell's home in Graham, Washington, for a scheduled supervised visit between Josh and his sons. The visit was supposed to last only a few hours. When the boys ran toward the house, Josh opened the door briefly, then quickly slammed it shut behind them. The social worker immediately sensed something was wrong. She tried to open the door. It was locked. Inside the house, Josh Powell had already made his final decision. He attacked the boys with a hatchet before igniting gasoline he had spread throughout the home. Within seconds, the house erupted in flames. By the time emergency responders arrived, it was too late. Josh Powell, Charlie, and Braden all died in the fire. The explosion ended any chance investigators had of confronting Josh Powell directly about Susan's disappearance. But it did not end the case. Authorities continued searching for Susan Powell's remains for years afterward. Investigators returned to desert areas, mines, and remote locations across Utah and Nevada. Despite extensive searches, Susan has never been found. Police believe Josh Powell murdered her the night she disappeared, and later disposed of her body somewhere in the remote desert landscape. The exact location remains unknown. Today, the case of Susan Powell stands as one of the most disturbing family tragedies in modern true crime. A woman who feared for her life, 2 young boys caught in the middle of an unraveling family, and a husband whose story never quite matched the evidence. Investigators may never recover Susan's remains, but the record of what happened, the warnings she left behind, the evidence uncovered by detectives, and the tragic events that followed, have ensured that her story will not be forgotten. Susan Powell was 28 years old when she disappeared. Charlie was 4. Braden was 2. 3 lives taken. And one mystery that still waits, somewhere in the Utah desert, for its final answer. This is Decades in the Dark, where science brings the past to light. Subscribe for more stories where justice never expires.